Speaker, as we will be recessing tomorrow for the week, next week many of us will be celebrating America's Independence Day back home in our districts and throughout the country. Very few of us will be here, a few may, but we're rarely, if ever, on the floor of the U.S. House on Independence Day. It is obviously a day not just worth celebrating, but that the founders intended specifically for us to celebrate. I recall now 4 years ago, in the summer of 2020, in the midst of some of the protests and riots and burning of buildings, tossing of statues and damaging of statues throughout the country in the summer of 2020, there was a lot of efforts to tear down monuments and memorials. And I took my staff and I drove to Philadelphia on July 2nd. We were here late, right up through that day. I think we'd finished voting on the 1st. So on July 2nd, I went up and I drove with my staff and went to Philadelphia, and I went to Independence Hall and visited with the National Park Service there, who were caring for Independence Hall. Fortunately, there was nobody at that point threatening to damage Independence Hall. There were some rumors and concerns. And I recorded a video there and talked about the importance of Independence Hall. And in that speech, or in that video, when I recorded that, I pointed out that it wasn't the bricks and the mortar, it wasn't the building itself, it wasn't the structure. That's all interesting to go see from an historic standpoint. But it was what those men did inside of Independence Hall that changed the course of history forever. And the National Park Service was very gracious. They allowed me and my staff, 3 staff members with me, to go into Independence Hall on July 2nd. And we were alone. It was just us because it was closed down for public tours, because you'll remember this was during the time of COVID. And we were able to be in Independence Hall on July 2nd. Now, why is that interesting? Well, because the students of history will know that that was the actual monumental day. That was the day that our leaders of this, then the colonies, but the founders of this country, the leaders, broke away from the crown. That was the day that they voted. On July 3rd, the next day, John Adams wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail, back home in Massachusetts, in which he wrote the following. Remember, of course, he couldn't call her, he couldn't text her, he couldn't send her an email. So he wrote Abigail a letter that would get to her, saying, quote, "Yesterday the greatest question was decided, which ever was debated in America, and a greater perhaps never was nor will be decided among men. A resolution was passed without one dissenting colony, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and as such they have, and of right ought to have, full power to make war, conclude peace, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which other states may rightfully do." The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and the blood and the treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even although we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not. Now again, that was July 3rd, 1776, the day after those men voted in Independence Hall to separate from the crown. Now, they had not yet adopted the Declaration of Independence. That would occur the following day, on July 4th, 1776. Now, obviously, Mr. Adams thought July 2nd would be the day that would be celebrated. Of course, as it turns out, because the Declaration was signed and dated July 4th, that became the day in which we celebrate our independence and all that flows from it. Might seem trivial, and in some respects it is, right? So long as we're celebrating. But in the midst of the parades and the fireworks and the hot dogs and the fun of next week, we should remember why. We should remember what Mr. Adams wrote to Abigail. We should remember what they sacrificed. Much is made in this town often of the palace intrigue of what one member says to another or who's endorsed by another. Much is made of relationships and who has angst with whom. Shall we not remember that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were literally at each other's throats, fighting because they disagreed so vehemently about the power of government, federal versus state? Shall we not forget the duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton? Shall we not forget the massive disputes our country has wrestled with? And I'll just say this, gladly. It is one of the great things about this country that we with passion shall engage on behalf of the people that we represent to come here and fight for them. To stand up and do something that we said we would do when we came to this town to change the trajectory. To preserve the republic that these gentlemen met and pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to defend. And they meant that, and they knew what it meant. And I think it merits a debate here among our colleagues on both sides of the aisle, in both chambers, in the executive branch, in the judiciary. What is it that we are doing? What are we doing on behalf of the people who sent us to this town? What animates us? Is it to get reelected? Is it to raise money? Is it to chair a committee? Is it to have a certain amount of power? Or is it to fundamentally preserve and protect this great experiment for our children and our grandchildren? Is it to put all on the line? Many great patriots in this chamber wearing the battle scars of lost eyes and lost legs, both sides of the aisle, for fighting and standing and defend this country and defend the flag that sits behind the speaker's chair. But what are we doing? What are we doing as elected members of Congress? I hear often now from people that I represent, I'm tired of another sternly worded letter. I'm tired of yet another hearing. When they see the country that they love being attacked not necessarily by enemies abroad, but by our own people and in many cases our own leaders. The people whom I represent, who reach out to me, who pull me aside in an airport or pull me aside at home or pull me aside in the supermarket or at school when I drop my kids off. They don't come to me asking about some endorsement or some conversation had among members on the floor. They come to me and they ask, why am I not living free? Like, what's happening? What is wrong with our country? And in this week in which we're going to celebrate freedom and celebrate independence, 248 years removed from what I just described in the letter from Mr. Adams to Mrs. Adams. Are we free? It's a legitimate question. Are we a free people? Some people might superficially just say, well, sure, of course you're free. You can walk out of the chamber, Mr. Roy, and you can walk out and say what you want, do what you want. And superficially speaking, compared to certain other places and times in history or other parts of the world, you could argue that we're free. But are we free? Can we say what we want? Can we speak freely without the power of government being used against us? Can we pray at an abortion clinic without being put in jail for 2 years if you're 75 years old, as the Department of Justice just did? Can you speak your mind and say that you believe in the institution of marriage without being threatened with losing your job or potentially punished with hate speech? Can you? Can you speak freely about a man and a woman, the definition thereof, and that a man not be able to swim against a woman in a meet? Yeah, you kind of can, but can you? Can you send your kids to a school where your kids can pray to the God under which this nation was founded? Can you, in that school, trust that your children are going to be taught the values of Western civilization and the founding principles that gave us this great country that indeed ultimately led to the abolition of slavery and freedom for people around the world? Will you be taught about the bravery and the courage of the men at Lexington and Concord, or in Independence Hall, or in all of the battlefields during the Civil War, or in World War I, or in World War II, and storming the beaches? Will you be taught about that great history? Or will your kids be taught to apologize for being American? Are you free if you're sending your kids to school with tax dollars for your children to be indoctrinated and taught that your nation is not great or that your God does not exist? Are you free? Or are you slave to a tyranny of government that tells you you must pay taxes to something that will say the secular world itself, its own religion, is something you must subsidize and you must bow down to? Are you free if your military is more focused, as many reports have been showing, on advancing non-binary, transgender, lesbian, gay issues than on a military focused on defending the United States of America? Are you free if we're continuing to advance our military into war or fund wars abroad without actual declarations of war, with 20-something-year-old authorizations of the use of military force, without ever having a really thorough and full debate on the floor of the House? Are you free if you are continually funding war to the detriment of your own financial well-being and the death and destruction of many of your own colleagues? Are you free if your daughter could be registered to be drafted, as the United States Senate just voted to require out of the Senate Armed Services Committee and sent down to the floor, and many Republicans voted for it? Are you free if your daughter can be forced to register for selective service and be drafted? Are you free if you have $35 trillion of debt, you have $1.1 trillion of interest, if you're racking up $1 trillion of debt every 2 to 3 months? Are you free if the U.S. dollar is getting destroyed and you can't afford the groceries and the necessities of life and the car to go take your family to their job or to their school or to carry out your business if you're a plumber or an electrician or any other job? Are you free? Are you free if your leaders are spending your nation into oblivion and undermining your economic freedom and well-being? Are you free if your borders are so wide open that your own people are getting killed and murdered by those that are being left into the streets, out of the jail cells, and the criminals from other parts of the world? Are you free? Do you think Laken Riley's parents feel free? Do you think the little 12-year-old girl that was just raped in Iowa by 2 illegal immigrants led into the United States and paroled by this administration, do you think they feel free? Do you think that the parents of the 13-year-old girl that was raped, murdered, do you think that the families of the Maryland women, Rachel Marin, Kayla Hamilton, that these individuals, do you think their families who lost their loved ones, do you think they feel free? Because without security, how are you free? Do you think all the parents who've lost their loved ones to fentanyl poisoning with fentanyl pouring into the communities, are they free? Are we truly free? Are you free to comment about presidential elections without being targeted by the Department of Justice? Are you free to talk about schools without being targeted by the Department of Justice? Are you free to go forward and protest in favor of life without being targeted by the Department of Justice, as Mark Houck had happened to him? Are you free to speak freely about the abuses of transgender surgeries in a hospital in Texas Children's Hospital, and not have the Department of Justice come in and prosecute you, as just happened in Texas? Are you free? Are you free if the Department of Justice wants to make you a criminal because you sell a single gun to another person in Texas? To create a national registry to be able to track those weapons? Are you free? Are you free if you can't go buy the automobile of your choice because a bunch of people in Washington have said, no, we've got to regulate it and make it more expensive, we've got to mandate electric vehicles, and now they're piling up on lots and you can't afford the internal combustion engine that you used to be able to go get? And now you're wondering how you're even going to replace the car you have that you need to get around to do your job and carry out your life. Are you free? I would suggest to you that in supposedly the freest and greatest country in the history of mankind, that we are no longer free. I would suggest to you that as we are heading in to celebrate this week, to celebrate the great birth of liberty that this country provided for the world, that we have been stripped of that liberty and that we have been trading it away. And that we have been trading it away right here from the floor upon which I stand. And that we have done so even this year. These are the questions with which we should wrestle. These are the great debates we should have. I'm exceptionally proud to be an American. I'm exceptionally proud to be in Congress. I believe that this country can and must be free again. But a country that has no borders, a country that is $35 trillion in debt, a country whose government is weaponized against its own people, a country that doesn't even know how to define man and woman or pay honor to the God upon which this nation was founded, is not a free country. If we are going to do anything in this body, as Republicans or Democrats, if we're going to do anything in this election cycle, if we're going to do anything in the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, it should be to restore our fundamental God-given rights and to reduce the size, scope, and power of a government that is operating completely in opposition to those liberties. The people who struggle today in this country struggle primarily because of the government that is operating against them, not because the government is protecting or helping them. The people who struggle in this country today, it is because of a burdensome, large, indebted government that has lost sight of the reason it exists and the fact that it is through the consent of the governed that it has its power. The other thing that happened on July 4th, somewhat miraculously, was that both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams passed away. 50 years to the day of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a document in which both had significant hands in writing. Jefferson obviously being the primary author. On June 24th, 1826, about 10 days before Jefferson died at his home in Monticello, he wrote the following: "To the mayor of Washington, upon having to decline the invitation to the 50th anniversary celebration due to his health, which obviously failed him 10 days later. He wrote, "May our independence be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all. The signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. That form which we have substituted restores the free right to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science is already laid upon to every view. The palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are grounds of hope for others. For ourselves, let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights and an undiminished devotion to them." I hope that as we go out as representatives of the people in this great republic over the next week and go home to our districts, I hope we will remember those words. But that ultimately doesn't mean much. I hope that when we come back to this chamber, we will remember those words. I hope that as we form our plans for the coming years, that we will embrace with the seriousness and resolve of all those we celebrate and to whom we give lip service, of our great admiration for their sacrifice and their courage, whether they wore the uniform and stormed the beaches at Normandy, or they fought for our freedoms at our founding, or whether there were these men in that room, or whether there are those who came before us representing the people in this chamber. It has to be more than just simple words of recognition. It can't be a fancy celebration at an 80th anniversary of D-Day. We have to actually carry out those words of affection by being willing to sacrifice our own well-being and good for the next generation. Because that is what we have lost. We have lost the willingness to sacrifice it all so that the next generation might live free. To give up the comforts of promises from a federal government, of continued checks, continued welfare, to give up the trappings of, frankly, a heavily falsified world of comfort in suburban America, propped up by profligate government spending, waiting to teeter off the edge. This is not about personalities in this chamber. This is not about someone being too caustic or mean to one of their colleagues. Grow up. Wake up. Understand your duty. Understand that when you come here and you swear an oath and you sit before that flag and you sit in this chamber and all the speeches that come before it, that we owe it to all of those 400,000 in Arlington National Cemetery and the thousands of cemeteries across this country in which those who gave or were willing to give the last full measure of devotion, we owe it to them and those who risked it all, to risk it all ourselves. What good is an election certificate that we are unwilling to use in fullness? This next week, I will look forward to riding in a parade in Central Texas and celebrating with my 14-year-old and 13-year-old, my wife and my friends and family, just like everybody else. And I'll have a good time doing it. But when we come back here on July 8th, Let us set out to do the hard work that is actually required. Not the pointing of fingers, not the recriminations, but actually set out to do the things we said we would do to cut the profligate spending, secure the border of the United States, make our military the strongest military it can be, sparingly used, giving them the care when they get home, the tools to carry out their jobs, healthcare freedom, going to the doctor of your choice, energy freedom, being able to get reliable energy in the cars of your choice without dictates from the bureaucrats in this town that are crushing the American dream. America's going to turn 250 years old in 2 years. Are we going to give as the birthday present for America turning 250 years? Are we going to give our kids and our grandkids their birthright, or are we going to take it away from them? I hope it is the former. And with that, I yield back.